The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Gunnison, Colorado, as Martha Ashford spread her last 5 quilts across the weathered wooden table outside the general store, each one a masterpiece of careful stitching that represented not just fabric and thread, but pieces of her vanishing life. The year was 1883, and the small mountain town had seen better days, though not as many better days as Martha herself had known before the fever took her husband Samuel just 8 months prior, leaving her with a small ranch she could not maintain, debts she could not pay, and skills with needle and thread that might keep her fed for another few weeks if she was lucky. She smoothed her hands over the top quilt, a wedding ring pattern done in blues and creams that had taken her 3 months to complete during the long winter evenings when Samuel was still alive, and would sit by the fire reading aloud from dime novels while she worked. The memory brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them back firmly. 24 years old was too young to be a widow. Everyone said so, but age did not matter when it came to grief or hunger or the cold reality of an empty purse and a mortgage payment due. How much for the lot? A voice asked, and Martha looked up to see a tall cowboy standing before her table. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but his boots were good quality and well-maintained, and the horse tied to the hitching post behind him was a fine bay gelding that spoke of a man who took care of what was his. "I am selling them individually," Martha said, touching the blue and cream quilt again. "This one is $15. The others range from 12 to 20, depending on the complexity of the pattern." The cowboy stepped closer, and Martha noticed his eyes were a striking shade of gray-green, like sage after rain. He examined each quilt carefully, running work-roughened fingers over the stitching, checking the corners and the binding with the care of someone who actually understood the craft. "My mother was a quilter," he said quietly, as if reading her surprise. "Taught me to appreciate good work when I see it. These are exceptional. I will give you $80 for all 5. Martha's breath caught. $80 was more than she had hoped to make from the entire lot, even if she sold them individually over the course of weeks. It was enough to pay 2 months on the mortgage and buy supplies to get through, until spring when she might be able to sell the ranch itself, assuming anyone wanted to buy a small property with a house that needed repairs and land that had been neglected since Samuel died. "That is very generous," she managed to say. "But why would you need 5 quilts?" The cowboy met her eyes, and she saw something indefinable there, a quiet sadness that matched her own. "I have my reasons," he said simply. He pulled a leather wallet from his vest pocket and counted out $80 in bills and coins, laying them on the table between them. "Kirby Hawkins," he added, as if in afterthought. "I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here." Martha had heard the name. Everyone in Gunnison knew of the Hawkins Ranch, a prosperous cattle operation that had been in the family for 2 generations. What she had not heard was that Kirby Hawkins ever came to town or spoke to anyone much at all. He was known as a recluse, a man who kept to himself and handled most of his business through his foreman. "Martha Ashford," she replied, gathering the money with trembling fingers. "These quilts mean a great deal to me. I hope they serve you well." "I am sure they will," Kirby said. He began folding the quilts carefully, precisely, the way someone who understood their value would handle them. Martha found herself wanting to help, and together they wrapped each quilt in the brown paper she had brought for this purpose, tying them with string. "You made these yourself?" Kirby asked as they worked. "Yes, over the past 2 years. My husband Samuel used to say I was wasting my time on fancy stitching when there was mending to be done, but he said it with a smile. He liked to see me happy." "You are widowed then," Kirby said quietly. It was not really a question. 8 months now. The fever. I am sorry, that is a hard thing. They finished wrapping the last quilt in silence. Martha felt strange, almost guilty, for selling these quilts that held so many hours of her life. So many evenings of hope and peace when the world seemed manageable and the future certain. But sentiment did not pay mortgages, and she had learned in these past months that survival required letting go of many things she once thought essential. Kirby loaded the quilts carefully into his saddlebags and across the back of his saddle, securing them with practiced efficiency. He turned back to Martha one last time, tipping his hat. "Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. These will be cherished." Then he was gone, riding north out of town, and Martha stood alone by her empty table with $80 clutched in her hand, and a strange hollow feeling in her chest that was not quite sadness and not quite relief, but something suspended between the two. She went to the bank immediately and paid down 2 months on the mortgage. The banker, Mr. Henderson, a round man with spectacular mutton chops and a perpetual expression of disapproval, counted the money twice before giving her a receipt. "You should consider selling that property, Mrs. Ashford," he said, as he always did. "A woman alone cannot manage a ranch, even a small one. Better to cut your losses and move to Denver where you might find work as a seamstress or governess." Martha bit back the sharp reply that rose to her lips. She had heard this advice or variations of it from every man in town, and some of the women too. Everyone had opinions about what widows should do, and none of those opinions included staying independent or trying to make a go of it alone. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said instead, taking her receipt and leaving before he could offer more unwanted wisdom. She bought flour and beans and salt pork at the general store, coffee and sugar and a small bag of cornmeal. The supplies filled her market basket and put a visible dent in her remaining funds, but a person had to eat. She was walking back to where she had left her wagon when she heard raised voices from the saloon. "I am telling you, Kirby Hawkins bought all 5 of the widow's quilts," someone was saying loudly. "Paid her $80 for the lot. What do you suppose a lone rancher needs with 5 fancy quilts? Maybe he is planning to take a wife," another voice suggested with a laugh. "Though I cannot imagine any woman desperate enough to marry that silent stone of a man. He barely speaks 2 words together." Martha felt her cheeks burn as she realized they were talking about her transaction, her quilts, and the quiet cowboy who had bought them. Small towns had long memories and loose tongues, and apparently a man buying quilts from a widow was noteworthy enough for gossip. She hurried to her wagon, stowed her supplies, and drove out of town faster than was strictly safe on the rutted road. The drive back to her ranch took 40 minutes, and with each passing mile she felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. The property was small as ranches went, just 160 acres with a house, a barn, a chicken coop, and fencing that was falling down in places. Samuel had bought it with dreams of building something substantial, but the fever had taken those dreams along with his life. Martha unhitched the horse, a gentle mare named Daisy who had been her wedding present from Samuel, and led her to the barn for water and hay. She fed the chickens and collected eggs, noting that 2 of the hens were getting old and would likely stop laying soon. Everything was slowly falling apart, no matter how hard she worked to maintain it. Inside the house, she started a fire in the stove and began preparing a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The house felt empty and too quiet without Samuel's voice filling it with stories and observations and gentle teasing. She had grown up the youngest of 6 children in a farmhouse that was always loud with activity, and the silence of widowhood was sometimes harder to bear than the grief itself. She was sitting at the table eating her solitary meal when she heard a horse approaching. In Gunnison, unexpected visitors after dark were rarely good news, and Martha felt her heart begin to race as she went to the window and peered out into the gathering twilight. It was Kirby Hawkins, sitting atop his bay gelding and leading a pack mule loaded with what looked like lumber and supplies. Martha opened the door, confused and wary. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, "is something wrong with the quilts?" Kirby dismounted, moving with the easy grace of a man who spent most of his life in the saddle. "Quilts are perfect," he said. "I came to fix your fence." Martha stared at him. "I beg your pardon. Your east fence line is down in 3 places. Your barn door is hanging crooked. Your chicken coop has a hole big enough for foxes." He said all this matter-of-factly without judgment. "Figured I would fix them. Mr. Hawkins, I cannot pay you for work like that. Did not ask you to." He began unloading the mule, stacking lumber and tools with careful precision. "You sold me something I needed. This is me returning the favor." Martha wanted to argue, but the truth was she desperately needed those repairs and had no idea how she was going to manage them herself. Pride was all well and good, but practicality had to win sometimes. "At least let me offer you supper," she said. "It is only beans and cornbread, but there is plenty." Kirby looked at her for a long moment, those gray-green eyes unreadable. Then he nodded once. That would be welcome. He took care of his horse and mule first, settling them in the barn with water and feed. Martha watched from the doorway, noticing how gentle he was with the animals, how he checked their hooves and ran knowing hands over their legs looking for injuries or problems. A man who cared for his animals like that was generally a man who could be trusted. Inside, she dished up a plate of beans and cornbread and poured coffee. Kirby washed up at the basin and sat down at the table, removing his hat and placing it on the chair beside him. His hair was indeed too long, falling almost to his collar, but it was clean and he smelled of soap and leather and the outdoors. They ate in silence for several minutes. Martha had grown used to silent meals in the month since Samuel died, but this silence felt different, not empty but simply peaceful, as if words were not necessary for 2 people to share space comfortably. "These are good beans," Kirby said finally. "You are a good cook." "Thank you. My mother taught me. She believed a woman should be able to feed a family properly, whether in times of plenty or scarcity. Wise woman. She was, still is, I suppose, though I have not seen her in 3 years. My family is in Ohio, too far to visit easily." Kirby nodded. "My mother died when I was 16. My father followed her 5 years later. I have a sister in California, but we have not spoken since she married. She wanted me to sell the ranch and move west with her. I refused." "You love the land," Martha said. "It was not a question." "I do. It is the only thing that makes sense to me. Animals and land and seasons. People are more complicated." Martha smiled slightly. "People are definitely complicated, though I confess I find myself missing even the complicated conversations now that I am alone." "Loneliness is its own kind of hardship," Kirby said quietly, and Martha heard in his voice an understanding that went beyond polite sympathy. This was a man who knew what it meant to be alone, even before death took anyone from him. After supper, Kirby insisted on washing the dishes despite Martha's protests. She found herself standing beside him at the basin, drying plates and cups while he washed, falling into an easy rhythm that felt strangely domestic and familiar. When everything was clean and put away, he retrieved his hat and headed for the door. "I will start on the fence line at first light," he said. "Should take me most of tomorrow to get it all repaired properly. The barn door I can fix in an afternoon, and the chicken coop will be quick work." "Mr. Hawkins, this is too much. You do not owe me anything." He turned to face her, and in the lamplight his expression was serious and intent. "Maybe I am not doing it because I owe you. Maybe I am doing it because it needs doing and I can do it and you need help." Martha felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the careful walls she had built around her heart since Samuel died. "That is very kind of you. Not kind, just practical." He settled his hat on his head. "Good night, Mrs. Ashford. Good night, Mr. Hawkins. And please call me Martha." "Kirby," he replied, and then he was gone into the darkness, riding back toward his own ranch 10 miles north. Martha lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the wind in the pines, and thinking about a quiet cowboy who bought quilts and fixed fences for widows and understood loneliness. She told herself not to read too much into it, not to let hope bloom where only practical kindness existed, but her heart was not listening to her head. True to his word, Kirby arrived at dawn the next morning with his tools and supplies. Martha fed him breakfast, eggs and bacon she could not really afford but felt obligated to provide, and he ate with the same quiet appreciation he had shown for her beans the night before. "You do not have to feed me," he said, echoing her own words from the previous evening. "I can bring my own supplies. You are working on my property. The least I can do is provide meals. Besides, I am cooking for myself anyway. It is no more trouble to cook for two." That was not entirely true, but it was close enough. And if she was being honest with herself, she welcomed the company, the presence of another person in the house, even if that person was not much for conversation. Kirby worked all that day on the fence line, and Martha went about her own chores, tending the chickens and the garden, washing clothes and hanging them to dry, trying not to watch him too obviously from the windows. He worked steadily and efficiently, setting posts and stringing wire, his movements economical and precise. Once she brought him water and a sandwich at midday, and he thanked her and drank deeply before returning to work. By evening the east fence was complete, the wire taut and the posts solid. Kirby walked the line once more to check his work, then came to the house to wash up before heading home. "I will come back tomorrow for the barn door," he said. "You do not have to," Martha said, but without much conviction. "I started the job, I will finish it." And he did. He came back the next day and the day after that, fixing the barn door and reinforcing the chicken coop, and even mending some loose boards on the front porch that Martha had not mentioned, but that clearly needed attention. Each evening he shared supper with her, and each evening they talked a little more, the silences between them growing comfortable and the words coming easier. She learned that he had been running his ranch alone for 8 years, ever since his father died. He employed 2 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse and helped with the cattle, but he kept mostly to himself, going to town only when absolutely necessary and avoiding social gatherings entirely. "People exhaust me," he admitted one evening over stew and biscuits. "Too many words, too many expectations. I never know what to say or how to act. Animals are simpler. They do not judge you for being quiet." "Some people value quiet," Martha said softly. "Some people find it restful to be around someone who does not need to fill every silence with noise." Kirby looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Martha felt her pulse quicken and told herself firmly that gratitude was not the same as affection, that a lonely widow had no business developing feelings for a man who was simply being neighborly. But the feelings bloomed anyway, persistent and undeniable as spring flowers pushing through snow. On the 4th day, all the repairs were complete. The fence was solid, the barn door hung straight and true, the chicken coop was secure against predators, and the porch no longer creaked ominously underfoot. Kirby surveyed his work with visible satisfaction, then turned to Martha. "That should hold you through winter," he said. "But if you have other problems, you send word. My ranch is only 10 miles north on the road past Miller's Creek. Anyone can tell you how to find it." "I cannot thank you enough," Martha said, and meant it. "You have been incredibly generous with your time and skills." "It was my pleasure." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I was wondering if perhaps you might consider selling me more quilts. If you make more, I would pay fair price." Martha blinked in surprise. "Mr. Hawkins, you already bought 5 quilts. Surely you do not need more." "Maybe I just like your work," he said, and there was something in his voice that made Martha's breath catch. "I would be happy to make more quilts for you," she said carefully, "though it will be some weeks before I have another completed. I can only work on them in the evenings after the other chores are finished. No rush. I am a patient man." He collected his tools and loaded them onto his mule, moving with the same careful efficiency he brought to everything. Martha watched him, memorizing the line of his shoulders and the way his hands moved, sure and capable. "Kirby," she said as he was preparing to mount up. He turned, and she forced herself to continue despite her suddenly racing heart. "Would you perhaps like to come to dinner on Sunday?" "A proper dinner, not just work meals. I could make a roast chicken and pie." She saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been pleasure. "I would like that very much. Around noon. I will be here." After he left, Martha stood in the yard for a long time, watching the dust settle on the road and feeling something that was dangerously close to happiness. She had not felt happy in so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like. That warm glow in the chest, and the sense that maybe, just maybe, good things were still possible. Sunday took forever to arrive. Martha cleaned the house until it gleamed, scrubbed floors and polished windows and beat rugs. She slaughtered and dressed one of her precious chickens, reasoning that some occasions warranted the expense. She made pie with the last of her preserved peaches, rolling out the crust with extra care to make sure it was perfect. She changed her dress 3 times before settling on her dark green calico, the one Samuel had always said brought out the color of her eyes. Kirby arrived precisely at noon, riding his bay gelding and carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He had shaved and gotten a haircut, and he was wearing clothes that, while still work-worn, were clearly his best. The sight of him making such an effort touched something deep in Martha's chest. "I brought you something," he said, handing her the bundle. Inside were 3 pounds of good coffee and a small sack of white sugar, luxuries that Martha had not been able to afford since Samuel died. "Kirby, this is too much. You have been feeding me all week. Seems only right to contribute." He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually serious face into something almost boyish. "Besides, I know you like your coffee strong and sweet." "How did you know that?" "I pay attention." They sat in the parlor before dinner, drinking coffee and making awkward conversation that gradually became less awkward. Kirby admired the quilts that still decorated the house, asking questions about the patterns and the techniques Martha used. She found herself talking more than she had in months, explaining the difference between piecing and applique, showing him how she planned her color schemes and cut her templates. "You should sell these in Denver," Kirby said, examining a particularly complex star pattern that hung on the wall. "You could get 3 times what you charge here in Gunnison. The wealthy women in the city would pay premium prices for work this fine." "I have thought about it," Martha admitted, "but getting them to Denver would require a trip, and the ranch needs me here. I cannot afford to leave for days at a time. What if you had help with the ranch, someone to look after things while you were gone?" Martha looked at him, trying to read his expression. "Are you offering to help me?" maybe I am offering more than that." Kirby set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Martha, I am not good with words, and I do not know how to say this except straight out. These past few days working here, eating supper with you, talking with you, they have been the best days I have had in years. You make me feel less alone, and I think maybe I do the same for you." Martha's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "You do," she whispered. "I bought those quilts because they reminded me of my mother, and I have been lonely for a long time. But when I saw you standing there in town, trying so hard to be strong, I felt something I have not felt in years. I wanted to help you. I wanted to know you. And now that I do know you, I do not want to stop. Kirby, we barely know each other. It has only been a week. I know. And maybe I am rushing things. But I am 30 years old, and I have spent enough of my life alone to know what I want when I find it. I want you, Martha. I want to court you properly if you will let me. I want to help you keep this ranch if that is what you want, or help you start fresh somewhere else if that is what you need. I want to hear you talk about quilts and listen to you laugh and sit across the dinner table from you every evening for the rest of my life." Tears were streaming down Martha's face before she realized she was crying. "I loved my husband," she said. "I loved Samuel so much, and I thought I would never feel anything for anyone else. I am not asking you to forget him or stop loving him. I am just asking if maybe you have room in your heart for something new." Martha thought about the past 8 months, the loneliness and fear and crushing weight of trying to manage everything alone. She thought about the past week, how easy it had been to fall into rhythm with this quiet man, how comfortable she felt in his presence. She thought about the future and realized that, for the first time since Samuel died, she could actually imagine one that did not look bleak and hopeless. "I think I might have room," she said softly. "I think I might have more than room. Kirby, these past few days with you have reminded me what it feels like to not be alone, and I realized something. I started falling in love with you the moment you asked about the quilts and actually cared about the answer." Kirby's face lit up with an expression of such joy that Martha caught her breath. He reached out and took her hands in his, those work-roughened hands that had fixed her fences and mended her barn and touched her quilts with reverence. "May I kiss you?" he asked. "Yes," Martha breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and questioning and perfect. They ate dinner eventually, though the chicken was slightly dry from being kept warm too long and neither of them cared. They talked about practical things, because that was easier than dealing with the enormity of what they had just admitted to each other. Kirby suggested that Martha could move her sheep and chickens to his ranch where they would be easier to care for, and she could use the freed-up time to make more quilts. Or she could sell this property and use the money to expand his ranch operation, creating something they would build together. "I do not want to lose myself in marriage again," Martha said carefully. "Samuel was a good man, but everything was his. The ranch, the decisions, the plans. I do not want to just be someone's wife, I want to be a partner." "That is exactly what I want too," Kirby said. "Partners. Equals. I have been alone too long to want anything less than a real partnership. Your quilts, your skills, your ideas, they all matter. We would build something together." They talked until the sun set and the stars came out, making plans and sharing hopes and getting to know each other in deeper ways. Kirby told her about his childhood, growing up on the ranch with parents who loved each other deeply, and showed him what a good marriage could look like. Martha told him about her family in Ohio, about Samuel and their brief happy marriage, about the pain of losing him and the struggle to survive afterward. "I should go," Kirby said finally, though he made no move to leave. "It is late and I have chores waiting at dawn. Come back tomorrow." Martha asked, "Every day if you will have me," and he did. Every day for the next 3 weeks, Kirby rode the 10 miles from his ranch to hers, helping with heavy work and eating meals with her and slowly, carefully, courting her the way people did when they knew that what they were building was meant to last. He brought her small gifts, practical things she needed like lamp oil and flour, but also more frivolous items like ribbons for her hair, and a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. Martha had never been courted like this, with such quiet intention and thoughtfulness. Samuel had courted her with grand gestures and flowery words, and she had loved it at the time, but this was different. This was a man who showed his feelings through actions, who listened when she spoke and remembered the small things she mentioned in passing. This was a man who saw her as a complete person, not just a potential wife. The town noticed, of course. In a place as small as Gunnison, nothing stayed secret for long. Martha endured knowing looks at the general store and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. Some people approved, saying it was good that two lonely people had found each other. Others disapproved, claiming it was too soon after Samuel's death, or that Martha was after Kirby's money, or that Kirby was taking advantage of a vulnerable widow. Martha learned to ignore the gossip. She had learned many hard lessons in the months since Samuel died, and one of them was that people would always have opinions about her choices. Their opinions did not have to become her burden. 1 month to the day after Kirby bought her quilts, he came to dinner carrying a small wooden box. They had just finished eating when he set it on the table between them and opened it to reveal a simple gold ring. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "My father gave it to her when they married, and she wore it every day until she died. I have been carrying it around for 8 years, never thinking I would have someone to give it to. But I want to give it to you, Martha. I want to marry you if you will have me." Martha stared at the ring, her eyes filling with tears. It was not fancy or expensive, just a plain gold band worn smooth with years of wear, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I want to say yes," she said. "But I need to know something first. You want children?" Kirby nodded. "I do. I have always wanted a family. What about you?" "Samuel and I tried for 3 years and I never conceived. I do not know if I can have children. Would that change your answer?" "No." Kirby said it firmly, without hesitation. "I want children, but I want you more. If we are blessed with children, that will be wonderful. If we are not, we will build a life that is full and meaningful anyway. There are always children who need homes if we decide to go that route. But Martha, I am asking you to marry me, not your potential children. You are enough, exactly as you are." Fresh tears spilled down Martha's cheeks. "Then yes. Yes, I will marry you." Kirby slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her, and Martha felt the last pieces of her broken heart slot back together into something new and whole. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Gunnison, with half the town in attendance out of curiosity if not genuine good wishes. Martha wore her best dress, altered with new lace she had purchased from the general store, and carried wildflowers that Kirby had picked that morning. He wore a new suit ordered from Denver and looked uncomfortable but happy, his eyes never leaving Martha's face as they spoke their vows. The preacher, Reverend Douglas, a thin man with kind eyes, kept the ceremony short and simple. Martha appreciated it. She had been through the long, elaborate ritual when she married Samuel, and while that had been special in its own way, this felt more real, more grounded in actual life rather than romantic fantasy. "I pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Douglas said, and Kirby kissed her with a tenderness that made Martha's heart overflow. They held a small reception at the church hall, with cake that the preacher's wife had made and punch that was heavily spiked by unknown parties. People offered congratulations that ranged from genuine to perfunctory. Martha's friend Sarah, one of the few people who had helped her after Samuel died, hugged her tightly and whispered, "I am so happy for you. You deserve this." Mr. Henderson, the banker, shook Kirby's hand and said, "You are getting a good woman, Hawkins. Treat her right." Which was rich coming from a man who had spent months telling Martha to give up and move to Denver, but Martha held her tongue and smiled graciously. By late afternoon, they were able to escape, riding together to Kirby's ranch, which was now Martha's ranch too. She had sold her property to a young couple from Kansas who wanted to try their hand at farming, and while she felt a pang of sadness leaving the place where she had lived with Samuel, it was softened by the excitement of starting fresh. Kirby's ranch was larger and more prosperous than she had expected. The house was a solid 2-story structure with glass windows and good furniture, and the barn and outbuildings were well maintained. He introduced her to his 2 ranch hands, Pete and Joe, both young men in their early 20s who tipped their hats respectfully and promised to stay out of the newlyweds' way. That first night in their shared home, Martha felt nervous in a way she had not expected. She had been married before, but this was different. This was Kirby, this quiet man who had become so important to her so quickly. They moved around each other carefully, both shy despite their earlier boldness, until Kirby finally took her hand and led her upstairs. "We do not have to rush anything," he said softly. "I know this is a lot of change all at once." But Martha did not want to wait. She had been alone for too long, had been merely surviving instead of living, and she wanted to claim this new life with both hands. She kissed him, putting all her feelings into it, and Kirby responded with a passion that had been carefully restrained during their courtship. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies and preferences, and afterward lay tangled together in the big bed that had been Kirby's alone for so many years. Martha felt tears on her cheeks again, but these were tears of relief and joy and gratitude for second chances. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Kirby replied, his arms tightening around her. "I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." Life fell into new patterns. Martha discovered that Kirby had not been exaggerating when he said he wanted a partner. He consulted her on ranch decisions, valued her input on everything from cattle breeding to crop rotation. She took over the household management and the kitchen garden, and began working on quilts again with a freedom she had not felt in years. The quilts he had bought from her that first day, she learned, were displayed throughout the house. One in the parlor, one in their bedroom, one in the guest room, and 2 in the bunkhouse for Pete and Joe. When she asked him why he really bought them, Kirby admitted the truth. "I saw you standing there looking so brave and so sad, and those quilts were beautiful, and I wanted to help you, but I did not know how. Buying the quilts was an excuse to talk to you. And then when I got them home and looked at them, really looked at them, I saw all the love and skill you had put into every stitch, and I knew I had to know you better. So I loaded up my mule with supplies and came back. You came back to fix my fences. I came back because I could not stay away." Winter came to Gunnison, blanketing the mountains in snow and making the world quiet and white. Martha had feared winter alone on her ranch, but winter with Kirby was magical. They spent long evenings by the fire, him reading aloud from books and newspapers while she quilted, recreating the peaceful domesticity she had known with Samuel, but in a new, deeper way. She started going to Denver once a month with a load of finished quilts, and Kirby had been right. The wealthy women of the city paid premium prices for her work. She made more money from quilting than she had ever dreamed possible, and she and Kirby began talking about expanding the ranch, maybe buying the property adjacent to theirs that had recently come up for sale. In February, Martha realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses and felt nauseated in the mornings, and when she finally admitted her suspicion to Kirby, his face lit up with such joy that she cried. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hand going reverently to her still flat stomach. "Fairly sure. I will know for certain in a few more weeks. But Kirby, after 3 years of trying with Samuel and nothing happening, I never thought this was possible." "Sometimes things happen when they are meant to," Kirby said. "Maybe you and I were always supposed to find each other, and this baby was always supposed to be ours." Martha had never believed much in fate, but in that moment, she wanted to. She wanted to believe that Samuel's death, and her hardship and Kirby's loneliness had all been leading to this to them, to a new life built from the ashes of old sorrows. The pregnancy was not easy. Martha was sick for months, unable to keep down more than broth and crackers, and she worried constantly that something would go wrong. But Kirby was patient and attentive, bringing her ginger tea and cool cloths for her forehead, holding her hair when she was sick, and never once complaining about the extra work her illness created. By summer the sickness had passed, and Martha bloomed with health and happiness. Her belly swelled with their child, and she felt stronger and more alive than she had in years. She continued quilting, though she had to adjust her position as she grew larger, and she made a special quilt for the baby, a simple log cabin pattern in soft yellows and greens. In October of 1884, 18 months after Kirby bought her quilts in the dusty street of Gunnison, Martha gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the local midwife and with Kirby pacing anxiously downstairs. But when the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry that seemed too loud for his tiny body, Martha felt a joy so profound it was almost painful. They named him Henry Samuel Hawkins, after both their fathers, and he was perfect. Dark hair like his father, green eyes like his mother, and a loud voice that suggested he would not be a quiet child. Kirby held him with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, and Martha knew that this child was as much a miracle to him as he was to her. "Thank you," Kirby whispered, kissing her forehead while their son squirmed in his arms. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me a family." "Thank you for finding me," Martha replied. "Thank you for buying my quilts." Henry was 6 months old when Martha discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, the morning sickness mild and brief, and she barely slowed down, caring for Henry and keeping up with her quilting and helping Kirby with the ranch work when she could. In December of 1885, she gave birth to a daughter, Grace Ann Hawkins, a tiny delicate thing with her father's gray-green eyes and a temperament that was somehow both fierce and gentle. Henry, now 14 months old and walking, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly and bring her his toys. The house that had once been too quiet was now filled with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family life. Pete and Joe, the ranch hands, turned out to be wonderful with children and would often watch Henry while Martha and Kirby worked. The ranch prospered, expanding to include the adjacent property they had wanted, and Martha's quilt business grew steadily. When Grace was 2 and Henry was 3, Martha made a trip to Denver with a load of quilts and returned with news that would change their lives again. A wealthy woman, Mrs. Catherine Morrison, had been so impressed with Martha's work that she wanted to sponsor a show of her quilts in a Denver gallery. It would be a first for quilts to be displayed as art rather than simply functional objects, and Mrs. Morrison believed Martha's work was fine enough to change people's perceptions. She wants to pay you a commission for 10 new quilts, Martha told Kirby excitedly. And she wants to sell the quilts from the show for premium prices, with you receiving 70% of the sale price. Kirby, this could change everything. Do you want to do it? Kirby asked. It sounds like a lot of work. I do, but it would mean I would have to spend more time quilting and less time helping with the ranch. Then we hire more help. Martha, you have supported my dreams from the day we married. Now it is time for me to support yours. If you want to make quilts and have them displayed in galleries like the art they are, then that is what we will do. Martha threw her arms around him, nearly knocking over the chair he was sitting in. Have I mentioned lately that I love you? Not in the past hour, Kirby said, grinning. I was starting to worry. The show was a tremendous success. Martha spent 8 months creating 10 of the most beautiful, complex quilts she had ever made, and when they were displayed in the gallery in Denver, people came from all over Colorado to see them. Newspapers wrote about her work. Women's magazines requested interviews. All 10 quilts sold within the first week for prices that seemed impossible to Martha. She became, in a small way, famous. Not enough that it changed their daily life in Gunnison, but enough that her name was known in quilting circles across the West. Other women began writing to her, asking for patterns and advice, and she found herself becoming a teacher as well as an artist. Through it all, Kirby remained her anchor and her partner. He expanded the ranch operation, building a small empire of cattle and horses that made them genuinely wealthy by Gunnison standards. But wealth did not change him. He was still the quiet cowboy who had bought her quilts and fixed her fences, still the man who preferred the company of animals to most people, still the husband who read to her in the evenings and made her laugh with his dry observations about life. Henry grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and loved horses even more. Grace was quieter, more thoughtful, with a tendency to sit for hours making intricate designs with whatever materials were at hand. Martha taught her to sew, and by the time she was 5, Grace was making simple quilt blocks that showed real promise. In 1888, when Henry was 4 and Grace was 3, Martha gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Thomas and Daniel. The house became even more chaotic, and Martha had to cut back on her quilting for a while to manage 4 children under the age of 5. But she did not mind. These were the good problems, the ones that came from abundance rather than scarcity. Kirby hired a woman from town, Mrs. Chen, whose husband had died in a mining accident, to help with the children and the housework. Mrs. Chen was grateful for the employment, and Martha was grateful for the help, and the arrangement worked beautifully. With extra help, Martha was able to get back to her quilting, and Mrs. Chen's children, 2 girls aged 8 and 10, became beloved playmates for Henry and Grace. The years passed in a blur of activity and happiness. The ranch prospered. Martha's quilts continued to sell well, and she eventually published a book of patterns that became a bestseller among quilters across the country. Henry and Grace and the twins grew strong and healthy, filling the house with the kind of joyful noise that Martha had missed since leaving her family home in Ohio. In 1892, 10 years after Kirby bought her quilts in Gunnison, Martha stood in the yard of their ranch and looked around at everything they had built. The house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. The barn was new and impressive, housing a stable of horses that were becoming known throughout Colorado for their quality. Fences stretched as far as the eye could see, all of them straight and solid, enclosing land that was productive and well managed. Kirby came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I am thinking about that day in town when you bought all my quilts. I was so scared and alone, and I thought my life was essentially over. And then you appeared, this quiet cowboy who barely said 2 words together, and everything changed. Best $80 I ever spent, Kirby said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. You changed my life that day. You gave me hope when I had none. You saw me when I felt invisible. You loved me when I thought I would never love or be loved again. You did the same for me, Martha. I was so lonely before you. I had the ranch and the work, but I was just existing, not living. You taught me how to live again. You gave me a family and a home and a reason to smile. Everything good in my life comes from you. They stood there together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Inside the house, they could hear their children laughing and Mrs. Chen calling them to supper. The sounds of life, of family, of home. Henry would grow up to take over the ranch, marrying a schoolteacher from Denver and giving Martha and Kirby 6 grandchildren. Grace would become a renowned quilt artist in her own right, eventually having her work displayed in museums. Thomas would become a veterinarian, using his natural gift with animals to help ranchers throughout Colorado. Daniel would surprise everyone by becoming a lawyer and eventually a judge, known for his fairness and compassion. But that was all in the future. For now, Martha was simply a woman standing in her husband's arms, watching the sunset and feeling grateful for second chances and quiet cowboys and the surprising paths that life could take. "Come on," she said, taking Kirby's hand. "We should go in. Mrs. Chen made pot roast, and you know how the children get if we are late to dinner." "In a minute," Kirby said, holding her close. "I just want to stand here with you for one more minute." So they did, and that minute stretched into several, and it was perfect. Everything was perfect. Not in the way that meant nothing bad would ever happen again, because life was never that simple. But perfect in the way that meant they had each other, and their children, and a life they had built together from almost nothing. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Martha worked on a new quilt in the parlor while Kirby read the newspaper. It was a peaceful, domestic scene, the kind that might have seemed boring to some people, but that felt like everything to Martha. "What are you working on?" Kirby asked, looking up from his paper. "Something special," Martha said. "I am making a quilt that tells our story. See this section here? That is the town square in Gunnison where we met. And this part is your ranch, and this is the fence you fixed. Each block represents something important in our life together." Kirby set down his paper and came to look at her work. The quilt was still in its early stages, but already the design was clear. It was beautiful and complex, a visual representation of their journey from loneliness to love to family. "It is amazing," he said softly. "You are amazing." "I want our children and grandchildren to have this," Martha explained. "I want them to know our story, how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best things, how love can come when you least expect it. How a widow selling her last quilts can meet a quiet cowboy and build a whole new life. They will treasure it," Kirby said, "just like I treasure you." He kissed the top of her head and went back to his chair and his newspaper, and Martha continued stitching, her needle flying through the fabric as she created something that was part art, part history, part love letter to the life they had built. Outside, the Colorado night was cold and clear, stars bright in the dark sky. Inside, the house was warm and filled with the quiet contentment of people who knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. In the years that followed, Martha would complete that story quilt and hang it in their bedroom, where they could look at it every night and remember how they started. She would make quilts for each of their children, special ones that incorporated their interests and personalities. She would teach quilting classes in Gunnison, passing on her skills to a new generation of women. She would continue to create and innovate and push the boundaries of what quilts could be. Kirby would expand the ranch further, becoming one of the most successful ranchers in Colorado. He would mentor young men who wanted to learn the business, sharing his knowledge freely. He would serve on the town council, using his quiet wisdom to help Gunnison grow and prosper. He would be known as a fair employer and a good neighbor, a man whose word was his bond. But through all their successes and accomplishments, the heart of their life remained the same. It was in the quiet evenings by the fire. In the morning, coffee shared before the chaos of the day began. In the way they still reached for each other in the night, seeking comfort and connection. In the laughter of their children and eventually their grandchildren. In the small daily choices to love each other, even when it was hard, even when they disagreed, even when life threw challenges their way. They would face hardships, because no life is without them. One particularly harsh winter would cost them a quarter of their herd. Grace would break her arm falling from a horse. Thomas would nearly die from pneumonia at age 12. There would be droughts and diseases and market downturns, and all the ordinary struggles that came with ranching and raising a family in the late 19th century. But they would face all of it together, the way they had faced everything since that day in Gunnison, when a quiet cowboy bought all the quilts a widow had to sell. In 1920, when Martha was 61 and Kirby was 67, they celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The house was full to bursting with family. 3 generations gathered to honor the couple who had started it all. Henry made a toast, raising his glass high. To my parents, who taught me what love looks like, who showed me that the best things in life are worth working for, who built something extraordinary from very little. Thank you for everything you have given us. Everyone drank, and there were tears and laughter and stories told about the old days. Martha caught Kirby's eye across the crowded room, and they smiled at each other. That same smile they had shared 1,000 times over the years, full of private understanding and affection. Later, when everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Martha and Kirby sat together on the porch swing watching the stars. They were older now, gray-haired and slower, but still strong, still together. "You remember that day in town?" Martha asked. "When you bought my quilts?" "I remember everything about that day," Kirby said. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, even though you looked tired and sad. I remember your hands shaking when you took the money. I remember thinking that I would do anything to make you smile. I smiled a lot that first week. Every time you showed up to fix something, I would smile after you left. I know. I used to ride away and then stop just around the bend and smile too. I felt like a fool, grinning at nothing in the middle of the road, but I could not help it. You made me happy." "You still make me happy," Martha said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You still make me happy too," Kirby replied, kissing her hair. "Every single day." They sat in comfortable silence, rocking gently, holding hands the way they had held hands for 38 years. The night was peaceful, the ranch quiet except for the normal sounds of animals settling for the night and wind in the pines. "I love you," Martha said. "I love you too," Kirby replied. "Forever." And that was exactly what it turned out to be, forever. Not in the sense that they lived forever, because no one does, but in the sense that their love created something that would last beyond their lifetimes. In the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. In the ranch that would stay in the family for generations. In the quilts that would become family treasures, passed down and cherished. In the stories that would be told about the widow who sold her last quilts, and the quiet cowboy who bought them all, and how that simple transaction became a love story for the ages. Kirby died peacefully in his sleep in 1925 at the age of 72, with Martha holding his hand. She grieved him deeply, but without the desperate terror she had felt when Samuel died, because she knew now that she was strong enough to survive anything, and because Kirby had given her so many years of happiness that she had more good memories than sad ones. She lived another 8 years, surrounded by family, still quilting even when her hands grew stiff with arthritis, still telling stories about the old days, still sharp-minded and opinionated right up until the end. She died in 1933 at the age of 74, in the house she and Kirby had built together, with her children and grandchildren gathered around her. Her last words were about the quilts. "Make sure the story quilt stays in the family," she told Henry. "Make sure everyone knows about the day your father bought all my quilts. That was the day my life really began." And they did make sure. The story quilt hung in the ranch house for 3 more generations, and every child who grew up there learned the story of Martha and Kirby, and how sometimes love comes when you need it most, in the form of a quiet cowboy who sees your worth when you are at your lowest, who buys your quilts and fixes your fences and gives you a reason to hope again. It was a story about second chances and unexpected blessings, and the way that one small act of kindness can change everything. It was a story about hard work and partnership, and building something meaningful together. It was a story about love, the real kind that lasts through good times and bad, the kind that creates families and legacies and memories that span generations. And it all started with a widow selling her last quilts in the dusty street of Gunnison, Colorado, and a quiet cowboy who bought them all.